Check, 1, 2, 3. Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here today. My name is Samantha, and I'll be the moderator today. And it's so exciting to come together on such an important topic. Today, it's called Brave and Safe, a place for courageous conversations. And I'd like to begin this morning with a land acknowledgement. So we begin today to acknowledge that we walk upon the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples, and we recognize their history, spirituality, culture, and stewardship of the land. Here in Ottawa, we acknowledge that the location that we dwell on is on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. If you're not joining us from Ottawa, we invite you to reflect upon the land in which you are joining us from. If you're unsure of what traditional land you're on, we invite you to visit nativeland.ca. On behalf of our funder, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, our partners, the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa, and Julian of Norwich Anglican Church, and the organizers, Brianna, Donna, Lee, and Susan, I would like to welcome you here today as we begin the important and sometimes difficult work of learning, unlearning, talking about racism, and finding ways to work together to become anti-racist. Our goal today is to provide a brave, safe, and inclusive space to discuss issues surrounding racism. We are hoping that through hearing the stories of a variety of speakers, you will learn about some of the different forms of racism. Sometimes they're internal, interpersonal, institutional, or structural, and the multitude of ways it presents itself. We are hopeful that by offering this opportunity to learn from the sharing and exchange of life stories and experiences, as well as through a facilitated discussion, you will gain new knowledge that will empower the ways you find ways to affect anti-racism change in your own lives and our environments and communities. We hope you will listen to understand and become social impact leaders, as well as have the opportunity to make some lasting connections. Now, a video from our funder.
Hi everyone, my name is Angela Lee, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Research at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. On behalf of the CRF, I bring warm greetings to the Brave and Safe event, a place for courageous conversations. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation is honored to support this initiative through our National Anti-Racism Fund. I would like to acknowledge that the land I'm speaking from is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13. I share this both to reflect on the lands that I'm settled on and the immense privileges that this has afforded to me, and as well to affirm the inherent treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples who have cared for and continue to care for these lands. It also serves as a personal commitment to the continued work with Indigenous nations and peoples to combat racism and mobilize action on the path towards reconciliation. I'm sorry I couldn't attend in person. I feel energized just reading the description of your agenda and the leadership that you are all taking on. I want to tell you about how the CRF was created, as I think this story connects well with the conversations you're having today. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation was created by the Government of Canada as a Crown Corporation in 1996 and as part of the Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement, an apology to Japanese Canadians for racial discrimination and internment camps during World War II. The CRF's mandate is to promote the development, sharing, and application of knowledge and expertise in order to contribute to the elimination of racism and all forms of racial discrimination in Canadian society. The conversations and connections you're making today are crucial and create an important space for young leaders in anti-racism to learn from one another, collaborate, and change systems. We are pleased to fund this event, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you for attending, and we hope that you're inspired by these discussions. Have a great afternoon.
As we welcome in
Thank you very
Annette.
much.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from her today, and I'm so excited to hear Annette Boozy come to the stage. So, Annette is a Black woman who has never been afraid to speak truth to power. She was raised in a multi-generational household of strong Black women who imparted on her the importance of challenging injustice. You're lucky to have that growing up. A lawyer by profession since 2009, Annette has been a professor in the School of Business at Algonquin College, teaching a broad range of courses in the Legal Studies program. In March 2020, Annette was elected by her peers to the role of president of OPSEU Local 415, the faculty union at Algonquin College. Annette is a board member of the Black Canadian Scholarship Fund, an organization established in '96 to encourage academic excellence and promote community leadership by providing annual scholarships to outstanding young Black students in Ottawa. Family is the joy of Annette's life. She enjoys spending time with her husband and 3 children. And Annette is a novice gardener. Let's welcome Annette to the stage.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to share space and to hold space with everyone today. I was asked to speak about my experiences with anti-racism, and I'm going to approach my sharing today in 3 ways. So one is through a little bit of education. I'm a teacher, and I think it's important that we have a common understanding of some of the terms that I'm going to be using today. 2 is through personal narrative. So I'll share with you a couple of stories and personal experiences that I hope will give you an understanding of my worldview and my stances on issues of race and racism and white supremacy. And 3rd, through a call to action, right? We're not here for the performance. We're here to do something with this new conversation. We're here to act. So I'd like to leave people with some thoughts on that. We don't know what we don't know, right? And it's really important once we know something to do something with that information. I'm a fan of the words of Maya Angelou, the poet and social activist, who said, when you know better, you do better. Right? And it's my hope that we all leave here today with a stronger understanding of what our respective roles can be in undoing some of the historical wrongs and harms and interrupt a cycle of oppression. So that's my thesis today, right? That it's not enough to talk about racism, that we have to do something about it. So if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time in the presentation. I will go where you go. You will lead where this conversation takes us. So I'm going to start with 3 terms that I want to define. The first is privilege, that we've heard folks talking about this morning, and I'm going to share how I use the term privilege. So when I use it, it's simply to mean a societal advantage, right? So as Samantha shared in the introduction, I'm a mom of 3 kids, and they all are into sports. We're a big basketball family. And when we were talking about succeeding in elite sports, we were talking about talent, right? We all know that you need talent to succeed at the highest level of competitive sport. But you also need a little bit of luck, right? It's easy for us to understand that most elite basketball players are really tall, right? So I wouldn't make a very good basketball player. And if you're born short like I am, you'd have a much harder time excelling at the sport, right? Where height provides you with a competitive advantage. So if we're going to continue with this sports analogy, it could mean a more advantageous schedule, right? Playing an opponent at the right time, or an opponent on the other team getting injured, right? And playing on a team with a number of athletes that complement each other well. So there are lots of talented athletes and hardworking athletes that simply don't win. They don't win a championship because they didn't have enough luck on their side, okay? So that luck in society, it translates to lots of different traits that we can have. And some traits are valued more than others. Some traits we can change, and others we can't, right? They're with us permanently. So we all have certain elements of societal privilege. For instance, I am able-bodied, right? I live in a tall, skinny house with lots of stairs, and I can go up and down those stairs right now with ease. But that might change over time, right? My level of privilege might change. I speak English and French, and I have a, quote, Canadian-sounding accent when I speak both languages, and that affords me a certain amount of privilege in the society that we live in, right? And there's a long list, and I'm sure lots of us can go up and down the list of lots of privileges that we hold. In my view, the biggest privilege that you can hold in this society is being a white man. And if you're tall, even better, right? Maleness and whiteness, they remove so many barriers in this society because, quite frankly, the rules were made by white men. They were made by white men in order for them to maintain power. And our history in this country, on this land, it confirms that to us. Europeans came to this land, committed horrible acts of genocide. They lied and betrayed the first peoples of this land and set up a whole structure of rules. And of course, the rules were to their benefit. And those rules are still deeply embedded in the fabric of this country. So we're only beginning to have discussions, to start conversations around real truth and real reconciliation. We are still unearthing bodies of children that were murdered at residential schools, the last of which closed in 1997. That's very recent history, right? The incarceration rates of Black and Indigenous people is exponentially higher than it is for white men. And since we live in a capitalist society, if we turn our minds to the corporate world, if we look at who's making the decisions there, who has agency in those spaces, it's still predominantly white men. And this is all by design. So, to summarize, privilege is a societal advantage. White privilege, and specifically white male privilege, I think, is the most powerful form of societal advantage that one can hold. So the second term that I want to discuss is racism, and how I'm going to use racism in the context of this conversation. Race is largely viewed as something that is socially constructed. We made it up, right? And it was made up based on things like someone's place of origin, their ethnicity, their ancestry, their beliefs. And it's essentially humans placing labels on ourselves to put us into categories, right? And by placing labels on other humans, it not only allowed societal divisions, but it created societal hierarchies, right? It justified the dehumanizing of others who belonged to groups that were considered subordinate. Right? So for example, the enslavement of millions of African people for hundreds of years because we were seen as having less worth than the white enslavers. So when we talk about racism today, a commonly held view is that these challenges are historical, they're in the past. We all have the right to vote, right? Hate crimes are now largely condemned in society. And we have human rights laws. So what's the big deal? Well, to pick up on what you were saying, the CHRC was recently told that the Canadian Human Rights Commission was told that the body that governs human rights is racist. Unpack that, right? The big deal is that colonialism and racism is so firmly embedded in the fabric of this country. I still feel the impacts of racism every single day. It's being followed around a store while shopping. It's assuming that I don't have the ability to do something. It's presuming that I don't belong in a particular space. It's being challenged in a way that my white counterparts are not. So the world seemed to have a racial reckoning with the murder of George Floyd, right? And that's because of the vividness of being able to capture the violence on a phone. It spoke to people. It spoke to white people in a very visceral way. We were in the early stages of the pandemic at the time, on lockdown, hyper-focused on social media, so the impact was different. I got messages from several white acquaintances that I had not heard from in months or years, just checking in on me. That was nice. It was a little bit uncomfortable, right? Police violence towards Black communities, it's not something that is new to us, right? I remember in 1987, the killing of Anthony Griffith. I'm a Montrealer, and this happened in Montreal at the time. He was a young, unarmed Black man. And it sticks with me today, right? That was my first visceral experience, and remembering my parents talking about it, our family talking about it. And I remember growing up and being cautioned by adults to not give the police a reason to stop me. This is ingrained in Black children because we know that we're not treated the same way by police. We're not given the benefit of the doubt, and things can end very, very badly. The violence that Black people suffer at the hands of police and the hyper-surveillance of Black bodies, it's a reality of existing in this society. There's this very naive belief that, these types of things, they don't happen here. They don't happen north of the border. We're immune to that. So I live in a neighborhood in central Ottawa, and the violent crime rate is relatively low in that part of the city. Not far from my house in 2016, Abdirahman Abdi, who you mentioned earlier, an unarmed Black man was killed at the hands of police. Mr. Abdi had a mental health issue. He was at a coffee shop where he was a regular. And that day, he was bothering some of the patrons. So a coffee shop employee called the police. They came minutes later. In the days after Mr. Abdi's death, the company's owner, the coffee shop's owner, Tracy Clark, made a public statement to the media. And the statement included the following: there was a real minimization of what the staff or customers in the store experienced. This comment may seem harmless and well-intended, but what it does is it connects to my earlier statement about racism placing a hierarchy on people. At a time when Mr. Abdi's family was grieving his death, when Black communities were outraged at the killing of yet another unarmed Black person at the hands of the police, the owner of the coffee shop, a white woman, chose to center other people's experiences. Let that sink in. Racism and white supremacy is just packaged a little bit differently in Canada. 4 years after Mr. Abdi's death, the coffee shop issued a statement that read in part, "We recognize that we can never fully become an ally to the Black community without addressing what took place 4 years ago to Mr. Abdi Rahman Abdi, a regular customer of ours who was killed by the police. We should have been an ally then, and we weren't. We are sorry. When we did speak, we spoke on the impact of his death, the impact his death had on our staff and customers, and not the greater issue of Mr. Abdi's death. We are truly sorry. So the apology is welcome. But like many, I question, why did it take 4 years? The timing, curiously, was about a month after the killing of George Floyd. So now I'll get into a little bit of my personal narrative before wrapping things up with a call to action. I'm the daughter of immigrants to this country. My mother was born in Trinidad and my father in Haiti. My youngest sister and I grew up in a 3-generational household of women. There's a lot of strength and a lot of power that comes from growing up in a household like ours. I have lots of childhood memories of my mother speaking her mind at just about every opportunity. Whether it was challenging an employer who was paying her white colleague more money, or calling out one of my teachers who had humiliated me in class, my mother was very quick to challenge something that she perceived as unjust, and has always been someone who didn't really struggle to find her voice and take up space in those types of situations. Conversely, my grandmother, who was born in Grenada in 1917, she had no trouble finding her voice at home, but she had internalized a lot of the racism that she had experienced in her life. My mother, who was a retired school teacher, told me a story of inviting my grandmother to see her, to see one of her student performances. It was the end-of-year concert. And my mom had reserved a seat for my grandmother right up front. And while she was walking my grandmother to her seat, my grandmother expressed to my mother concern about sitting in front of all of these white people. So in a moment where my grandmother should have felt nothing but joy, pure happiness for this beautiful moment that she should have been experiencing, she was preoccupied by making herself feel small in front of a group of white people. This is what the violence of racism does to people. My mother has been the biggest influence on my life. I'm a college professor today because I watched my mom in the classroom work her magic with students. And because of watching my mom, I knew that that was a possibility for me. But the further along I got in my education, the less people like me I saw. In my 8 years of post-secondary education, I had 3 Black professors, 2 in college and 1 in university. We're talking dozens of classes that I took over the years, and only 3 people who looked like me, right, at the front of the class. And I know that me being in the role that I am today, that in and of itself is an act of resistance. How lovely is it for students to see that I am leading the learning environment and that I'm at the front of the class. I'm one of the few Black professors at my college. I can only give anecdotal statistics, but there are very, very few of us. I can go down the shopping list of experiences of racism that I've had in my current job. From being introduced at a faculty meeting to a new team as the person that they hired because of my incredible sense of fashion, to a student calling me the N-word on social media and saying that I belonged on a plantation picking cotton. But I'd like to speak of the more nuanced experiences that it's sometimes harder for people to put their fingers on, right? Like, it's easy to see the big sensational stuff. It's harder to see the smaller stuff sometimes. And I'd argue that it's not the loud moments, it's not the obvious racism that hurts the most. It's the smaller moments where people and institutions can hide behind policy, they can hide behind rules to absolve themselves. It's the lifetime peppered with these small moments that's truly exhausting. A few years ago, I experienced a challenging situation at work. I was interested in an opportunity that wasn't offered to me because of a disagreement that I had about the way that I was to be compensated. So I documented everything, and then I approached my union for support. So when you work in a unionized environment, most of the time as a unionized employee, you have to go to your union for support. That's your first point to try to resolve a dispute, right? It's a worker's primary and in some cases the only recourse that you have against an employer is through your union. And in many cases, a union can be a gatekeeper for justice for workers, right? They hold the cards, they hold the tools to access justice in the workplace. I was initially told by my union that there wasn't much they could do about the situation that I brought forward to them. So imagine this. I'm in a situation of workplace conflict with my employer, who is white, and I go to my union representatives, who are also white, to ask for their help, to ask for their support, to ask for their guidance, and I'm turned away. So one of the many reasons why nobody felt there was a problem was because nobody had my lived experience. They didn't know what it was like to walk in my shoes, and for whatever reason, they didn't have the sense of humanity to be able to do so. So never one to give up. Remember, I said earlier I was raised in this multi-generational household of Black women who were never afraid to speak truth to power. I researched my problem, and I went back to my union with a full argument of my case. Essentially, I was the architect of the solution, of creating the solution. That's work that they should have been doing. But because of my skill set, right, I'm a lawyer by profession, I had the ability to be the architect of my own grievance, which ended up being successful. So one might say that this is a positive story. Hey, you got the result that you wanted, but I don't think it's positive. I shouldn't have been in this situation in the first place. But when I was in that situation, I should have been able to turn to my union and to get their full support fighting my employer. So instead of having one battle to fight, I had two. That's labor that was put on my shoulders, which shouldn't have been there in the first place. But imagine if I didn't have the skill set that I have. I would have suffered in silence, like most people do. I might have even doubted my experience, right? The employer says nothing's wrong, the union says nothing's wrong. I might have internalized the racism. I might have accepted the status quo, which is how the system is designed. So what came next was my increased involvement in my union. I felt that there were gaps in the union's leadership and gaps in the lenses that they were using to support the membership. So I started to make space for myself at the union leadership table. And that began to make a lot of people feel uncomfortable. In 2020, I competed for the role of president of the local, and I was successful in that. So I'm now the president of my union. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't easy. When I share my experience of transitioning to this seat of leadership, I describe it as, rather than the former union executives transitioning leadership with grace, they chose not to. It was March 2020. We all remember what happened in March 2020. I took office just a few days before the pandemic hit. I discovered a hidden camera in the union office. I discovered hundreds of disparaging emails about me that people had been opening and resealing my union mail. It was such a violation. And then when I went to the union headquarters to report things, I was initially turned away. Let's be forward-looking. Okay. Despite having a heavy heart about lots of things in society today, I still have a lot of hope that we can build a socially just society in our future. And that brings me to my final call to action about being anti-racist. Angela Davis says, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Well, what does that mean? In my life, there have been many people in positions of power who stood around and didn't do anything when they could have. That labor should not rest on the shoulders of people who are experiencing racism. We didn't create racial injustice, and we shouldn't be expected to fix it. There's no excuse today for not knowing about racism. The internet is full of resources. There are endless books. It takes a minimal amount of effort to learn about racism. Second, when you witness racism, do something about it. Call it to the person's attention. Challenge them on the comment that they make. Challenge them on the joke. Let the person who has experienced racism know that you saw what happened and that you support them. A good friend of mine, who is a white man and someone I consider to be an ally, said to me that his favorite way of stopping a racist joke is asking the person who told it to explain it. He'll simply say, "I don't understand why that's funny. Can you please tell me why?" That completely takes the wind out of their sail, and they can really think twice about telling it again. There are countless organizations that need support, both financially and with your time, and with your talents. They need it beyond a crisis situation where there is guilt around racism. There was a surge in support for Black organizations after the killing of George Floyd, but these can't be one-time commitments. Racism is so deeply embedded in our society, it needs us to keep our pedal on the gas. It needs a sustained commitment and a constant commitment to see it eradicated. So, thank you all for your time and your generosity of spirit. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Annette. I learned so much from your conversation. You have tremendous, not only lived experience, but I think we all felt in the room like some really tangible coaching on what it means to be anti-racist. So we do have a few questions for you from the audience. The first one is, given your breadth of experience now, what is one thing you would say to your younger self?
So I would say don't be afraid to take up space and don't make yourself small for anyone. It's something that I feel now and that I live now unapologetically, but it took me a while to step into that, right? When you feel that something is wrong, do something about it right away, and don't be afraid to be seen, right? The example that really touched me about my grandmother making herself small, I mean, it still hits me hard today, right? And, I can look back at moments in my life where I might have done that, and I would tell my younger self not to do that.
The power of stories is so powerful. I am going to remember that story about your grandmother and share it, because we don't want anyone to feel like that. And I look at my small children, 1 year old and 3, 2 of the 4, and I see my son 3 running to the front of the stage for things and participating, and it's natural for him, and I don't ever want him to have that limited mindset. So thank you for sharing that. You've brought them up already, like the tangible things on how to be anti-racist. It's a lot for someone when they're hearing it for the first time. And I got a note that said, how can myself as a white person be an ally? So can you just leave us today with that one message of that one thing that we could all just sort of like write down, stick it on our bathroom window, and just be like, okay, like this is where I need to go and need to be reminded of?
So a couple of things to unpack that question. The label of an ally is, I think, something that should come from the people that are receiving the allyship, right? So I wouldn't strive to become an ally, I would just strive to do better, right? And there's things that there's everyday things that you can do to be better. First is education, learn, read, absorb information about racism, and you were speaking earlier about curiosity, people asking questions. I think it was our co-panelist who was talking about that, being asked about hair. And it is a privilege to be curious, right? It is a privilege to be able to say, to have the audacity to ask questions about hair or about things that where are you from? And that is labor that shouldn't rest on the people that you are curious about, right? Educate yourself. Do the labor on your own. That is one step that you can take. And really not being silent. We all feel it in our guts when we know that something is wrong, when something is uncomfortable. Lean into that, right? It's not enough today to be silent about those moments of discomfort. You have to challenge those moments.
I love that so much. Thank you so much, Annette.
Maybe you've seen this graphic floating around the internet. It was designed by Andrew M. Ibrahim, and he gives Ibram X. Kendi and other modern anti-racism writers credit for many of the ideas within the graphic. I want to give you a quick overview of it because it's a useful tool. And then I want to show you a similar graphic we made that focuses on an anti-racism continuum for the workplace. So let's get into Dr. Ibrahim's graphic real quick. This graphic is broken down into 3 phases. As a person on a journey towards becoming anti-racist, you fall somewhere within this continuum. Ibrahim breaks this continuum into 3 main groups: the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. You can see that in the fear zone, we're either denying that racism is a problem, or we're not interested in or willing to take action to combat it. That is a comfortable space for people with race privilege. People sometimes get offended by that term, race privilege, so let me quickly define it to ease any defensive feelings toward that. Someone's ability to be in the fear zone means that their life is not negatively impacted by the color of their skin. It's not saying that their life is easy, that they've not had to work hard, and it doesn't negate struggles. It simply means that their life is not negatively impacted by the color of their skin. That's race privilege. And it's important to know not everyone has that luxury. If you're ready to move out of the fear zone, then you start to do some of these things in the learning zone. Asking questions, reading books, evaluating your privilege, listening to people who look different than you. And guess what? Some of the things in this learning zone are going to be shocking and upsetting and uncomfortable, because you'll learn that things you hoped weren't true, in fact, are true. Now, when you start to learn about and get shocked by the experiences of others, then hopefully you become motivated to push yourself into the growth zone. You start to speak out. You promote and advocate for policies that are anti-racist, and you yield your power to marginalized groups. The important thing to know here is that in order to move through this journey, to transition from the fear zone to the learning zone to the growth zone, you have to put in work. You have to allow for mental shifts, and you have to allow yourself to be uncomfortable. Also, equally important to note is that hitting the growth zone is not an end. While it's your goal to get there, staying there requires constant work. That becomes clear when you realize that all of the items listed in the growth zone are activities and not mindsets. It's not a matter of thinking these activities are good ideas. It's a matter of doing these activities. Now, from what Dr. Ibrahim created, we came up with a similar continuum for the workplace, starting again with the fear zone. Within this zone, you're complacent working in an organization that excludes people of marginalized groups. You're complacent working in an organization that demonstrates inequity in pay, hiring, and leadership. You intentionally or unintentionally choose to work most closely with people who look like you. You either do not understand or do not believe in the value that diversity brings to an organization, or you make comments or jokes that oppress marginalized groups. This list can continue, but you get the idea. And so, what are some characteristics that you can work towards that indicate you're moving from the fear zone to the learning zone? You start to notice and question why inequalities exist within the organization. You support and follow company-wide practices designed to mitigate bias. You understand that an organization is better when the workforce is diverse. You lead by example and speak professionally and honestly about others. And then ultimately, you want to move from the learning zone to the growth zone. In the growth zone, you ask questions of HR or leadership where you see inequality. Understand that working with people who do not look like you or have a similar background as you promotes richness in the organization. Understand that diversity creates advantages in problem solving, development, brainstorming, and really any other facet of the business. You continue to lead by example and help people facilitate the uncomfortableness. You allow time for change, understanding not everyone is at the same stage as you, but you don't grow complacent. And if policies don't exist that mitigate bias, you do your part to put some in place.